Unfortunately, Dawn wasn't able to make it today, and so you're stuck with me. But fortunately, I know this topic pretty well, so that we should be in good shape today. What I'm here to talk to you all about today is a travel rule. It's a new regulation that is being rolled out globally in 2020 for basically every company that's operating inside of the cryptocurrency ecosystem. Anybody that's actually holding coins on behalf of someone else applies underneath this rule. And the reason I wanted to talk about it today was A, we can help you solve the problem, but B, more importantly, this is actually one of the issues that's going to have the biggest impact on cryptocurrency over the coming year, as well as the coming decade. Because the way that we respond to and solve this problem is actually going to create what the future platform is that all of us build on top of. And therefore, it's really important that the choices that we make are creating the future that all of us have been building for the last 5 years, and not throwing us back into a lockdown banking system with no innovation and a very slow pace of change. So first, I wanted to give a little bit of background here about what some of the regulators are saying, because one of the first things that I hear frequently when I talk about travel rule or crypto or compliance or any of those things is, does this really apply to me? And how serious are the regulators? And the regulators are really serious this time. This is Ken Blanco. He's the FinCEN director. And he's actually come out, and his statements have been things like, telling us that your technology can't support this law is not a good reason to not support the law. It's a good reason to not launch your project. And so, coming back with answers saying we don't know how to do this isn't going to satisfy regulators. It's something we need to work out and solve today. Clayton, the head of the SEC, they actually came out with their enforcement priorities for 2020. They just announced them about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And two of the areas that were at the very top of their enforcement priorities for 2020 were digital assets, so cryptocurrency and other tokens, and then AML and KYC compliance. And so, this is two of the top regulators in the US. They're both very focused in this area. Steve Mnuchin, our beautiful Treasury Secretary, always got a smile on his face, open hand to help everybody out. He actually held a press conference where the entire purpose of the press conference was to tell the crypto industry that he was coming, and that US Treasury was watching, and that this was an area that was going to be very important to them, that they weren't going to allow crimes to continue to happen on these networks. And it's not just the United States, things are happening overseas as well. And I wanted to bring in the regulator from Switzerland, FINMA. And sort of the reason I wanted to bring that in is, as we talk about this regulation, it's a global regulation of travel rule, and I'm going to walk through what that is in a minute. But the way that the regulations are passed down, each country chooses their own way to implement and respond to that regulation. Some people are going to have looser controls. Some people are going to have tighter controls. And in this case, Switzerland has actually come up with a set of controls that are much tighter than the global law and would require a difference in the way that you build your solutions in order to respond to it. And I'll get to that in just a minute. And then some of it from our side, our background and my background in particular, we've spent a lot of time working with regulators, legislators, et cetera, around early technologies and how do you craft regulatory frameworks that are appropriate to that new technology and protect consumers, systems, and platforms, while at the same time allow for mass innovation, growth, value creation, et cetera. For me, that work actually goes back to the 90s when I was involved in running a trade association for internet providers, where we worked with legislators and regulators to protect online anonymity, for the Internet Tax Freedom Act, and a number of other rules that created the framework that the internet actually really grew up on. So what is the travel rule? What's sanctions, and who does it apply to? And as we talk about, there's a little bit of difference depending on who the regulator is that's implementing the standard and what jurisdictions you're operating in. So first, let me tell you what the travel rule is. The travel rule isn't about coins traveling. It's not about I went from the United States to Canada with my wallet in my pocket and I have to do something because of that. What the travel rule is actually talking about is that when you do a transaction that is covered by travel rule, identity information around the participants in the transaction needs to travel along with the transaction itself. So basically what that means is if I'm sending, and let's say that I'm on Circle and that you're on Coinbase, and I'm sending $1,000 worth of value between the two, before that transaction happens, my provider, Circle, would have to send all my identity information over to Coinbase so that they could run sanctions and other checks against me. And similarly, Coinbase would have to send back to Circle all of your PII information, your name, your country of residence, birth date, and some other details that we'll get into, before the transaction actually occurs. So the identity information needs to travel before the transaction so that my service provider can make sure you're not a bad guy and your service provider can make sure I'm not a bad guy. This rule applies in different ways in different jurisdictions. In the US, it has to do with any transactions over $3,000. The FATF global rule is for any transaction over $1,000. So there's some question whether the US will rationalize down to that lower number. But then finally, there's global sanctions. And global sanctions applies to any transaction regardless of the value amount. So as sanctions starts to get enforced in the crypto space, it's going to move this where identity actually needs to be exchanged with every single transaction that occurs that involves a regulated entity. So that falls down to the second line of the number of financial institutions required before travel rule applies. So in the case of the US, both sides have to be financial institutions for travel rule to apply. So if, for example, you were sending from Kraken, which is a regulated entity, to say your Edge wallet, which is a non-custodial wallet that runs on your phone, for travel rule, that doesn't apply to that transaction in the US because the Edge wallet on your phone is not an MSB or a regulated entity. In the case of FATF, the same is true. Both ends need to be a regulated entity before travel rule applies. Switzerland, I had the slide from FINMA, Switzerland, a few slides ago. In Switzerland, however, only one side needs to be a regulated entity for travel rule to apply. So if I'm on a Swiss exchange like Smart Valor, and I want to send to someone's Edge wallet, you need to apply travel rule and exchange identity to do that if you're an entity regulated by Switzerland. And then finally, when you talk about global sanctions, neither end needs to be a regulated entity in order for sanctions to apply. And so even if I was sending, say, from an Edge wallet on one hand to, say, a Bread wallet, which is another non-custodial wallet on the other, sanctions still applies in that use case. So it's a case where identity needs to be exchanged. And then here, I'm going to just skip by this. This is the actual data that needs to be exchanged as a part of that transaction. So things like name, account number, address, a link to the transaction, et cetera. And then, what happens if you're not compliant? There's a variety of things, and it's anything from, loss of reputation and risk with customers to fines and enforcement actions, and it could even lead to criminal penalties. To date, there's only been a couple of cases where AML has led to criminal penalties in the cryptocurrency space, but based on some of the statements from regulators, that may be ramping up in the future. So maybe I can talk a little bit now about how we've thought about solving this problem and going about working to allow companies to be compliant with travel rule without breaking the underlying nature of the blockchains that we're working on. So just first, I wanted to take through a really quick look at the timeline around this, which talks a little bit about how we've looked at this and talked about it internally. Back in May of 2015, which was, I think, 7 blockchains ago, what we saw was Ripple actually had an enforcement action from FinCEN where they signed a consent decree with FinCEN, where they said, look, you don't need to take us to court or anything. We'll just agree we did these things wrong. You'll agree to do this fine, and we'll walk away. And one of the items that was actually in that consent decree was travel rule, that Ripple had been in violation of it, that they needed to not be in violation of it in the future, and that they agreed that it applied to the kinds of transactions that they did. Well, we saw this as a shot across the bow to the industry and actually started working on a solution at that time. So we started working on it in May. We're doing technical development through the end of the year. And in March of 2016, we actually wrote and authored a Bitcoin standard, BIP 75, that allows companies that are working with any blockchain, any cryptocurrency, any token, public, private network, privacy coin, et cetera, to be able to be compliant with travel rule. We had a first implementation of that in June of 2016 with PricewaterhouseCoopers and a global bank. And in 2017, the standard was finally approved. And in 2017, also, MAS, the regulator in Singapore, did a study. They commissioned a report and a study on how do you build a compliant cryptocurrency ecosystem. And our tools in BIP 75 specifically were recommended as the ways to solve the problems around travel rule and sanctions in a way that still meets the standards that you would want to see in the cryptocurrency space. And then, this bullet all the way on the right a few years later in May of 2019 is when FATF introduced their guidance and everybody else in the world started working on this problem. So we've been thinking about this and working on this for quite a while to make sure that the solution lines up correctly. So enforcement cares about a few things. They care about global guidelines from FATF. Obviously, they care about the travel rule, about identity validation moving back and forth. Travel rule is today. I strongly believe, and everyone I talk to on the compliance side strongly believes, that sanctions is next. Right? Russia has announced that they violate sanctions using crypto. They want to do it more. Venezuela has done the same. Iran has a mining policy. North Korea has been caught using cryptocurrency to evade sanctions. Sanctions are coming for crypto. And enforcement actions are actually starting to ramp up. A couple of months ago, I was on an industry call with some of the top lawyers in the space, and one of them actually raised on the call that over the past year, they've started to see enforcement actions coming out of FinCEN and other regulators where travel rule is one of the items that they're working on and looking at as part of that enforcement. Some requirements from the industry side. We think the protocol needs to be entirely peer-to-peer where there's no censorship available by us or by anybody else. It needs to be private so that no one except the counterparties in the transaction can have any idea who's involved in the transaction. As a matter of fact, in order to protect the fungibility of the tokens on the chain, there's no mark left on the chain at all that KYC has occurred, that travel rule information has been exchanged, or anything else. And so in that manner, it allows private wallets to continue to operate privately, while custodial services or regulated entities can meet their compliance requirements. I talked about the fact that we built our solution through the standards process and released this as a community standard. We believe that it's important that no one company controls the standard or controls the network that is used for this as a way to ensure competition and that things continue to move forward well in the future. And it was important to us that the tool works with any blockchain, whether it's a public chain, whether it's a private chain, whether it's a coin that's native to the chain, whether it's a token that rides on top of the chain, whether it's a public chain like Bitcoin, or whether it's a privacy coin related chain like Zcash or Monero, it needs to work in all those use cases. And then, from a corporate perspective, it needs to be scalable, compliant, low cost, all those things that you expect. We've already met with regulators around this, whether it's MAS in Singapore, FinCEN here in the US, and other regulators globally. As a matter of fact, this is the only standard I'm aware of that's been recommended by regulators as a way to solve this problem. The protocol itself, as I talked about, is open source. It's free to use. It works with any VASP. It works with non-custodial wallets. It works with dApps. This is really important when we get into the sanctions world, because if your solution only works between regulated entities, that means that there's not going to be a way to get coins between the regulated world into the innovative world of non-custodial wallets, dApps, browser wallets, et cetera. And so we need to ensure that the identity standards that we're building and using allow coins to freely move between those different parts of the ecosystem in order to protect the innovation that we're trying to build. What we've built is so blockchain agnostic, it doesn't need a blockchain at all. And it can work in the future with self-sovereign identity and other standards. I'm going to skip the corporate requirements again and just say we can meet all of these requirements around scalability, et cetera. The user experience is exactly the same as users are used to today, except maybe slightly better. You know, they start out by scanning a QR code, feels familiar, enter the amount that they're going to send, right? They go ahead, press review information, and what comes back to them is all the info they had, plus the name of the person that they're going to send to. So I can actually know who I'm sending to before I confirm and finalize the transaction. At that point, I confirm the transaction, and everything is complete. All of the compliance information is available on both sides. The transaction on the blockchain looks just like any other transaction on the blockchain. It's a plain address-to-address transaction. And from the user perspective, the only change they had in their experience is that they had the opportunity to see who they were sending their funds to before the transaction was complete. And from the compliance officer's perspective as well, all of the data that's available or required to them about both ends of the transaction, as well as data like the signatures that are supporting that, is all available to them via API, dashboards, et cetera. I don't quite have time to walk through the protocol itself because we're running out of time, but if you stop by our booth out there, I'd be happy to walk you through the details as well as share a YouTube video that we have. And I'll take any questions that anyone has when we out at booth 101. Thanks, everybody.